My question based on the lecture is about you spoke about making changes to designs that will be beamed out on site and edited in just seconds. My question is, how do we get those systems to work in Africa since we have low computer network systems and people being less knowledgeable in information technology? That's my question.
That's an interesting question. I don't know what the amount of knowledge is when it comes down to production techniques and design techniques in Africa, but as we have learned that you can, in each country, of each location you work, you can adapt your system where you're working. So it is not particularly necessary to always use the most advanced technique. It is definitely possible also to come up with strategies who are local, slowly working methods who are adaptable to build in Africa. Techniques and design techniques in Africa, but as we learned that you can country each location you work adapt your system you work so it is not really necessary to always use the most advanced also to come up with strategies that are local.
Hello.
I'm just
Yeah, hello. Ethiopia is still trying to connect, so they sent me one question from Ethiopia, from Ken Nkrumah from EIABC. He's Belgian. He wants to know how and where do you put the border between declaration and spatial articulation?
No. I think it's clear. Well, the answer is not so clearly to be defined in the way how you can border it in a way. it's we believe that it is sometimes so that you can switch between the two very intuitively while you design, even in the way how you make a sketch model or working with new computational techniques. Maybe there are ways through the technique you work with that you sometimes you like to start with a spatial idea, what is related to how people meet, how people might see each other, how they work together in one space, or how people live with each other in one space, and then suddenly you might go towards the more technical side of the project where a wall suddenly becomes less spatial but more operational. So it's, and it doesn't matter to us so much where do you start and how do you start within the process. They need to find each other, as we like to say. It needs to work together.
Thank you. Okay.
Are there any other questions coming up from your side now? I'm talking now to the people we can see. Are there more questions?
Yeah, there's a lady here.
Please come to the microphone to ask so we can hear you.
Hello, Ben.
Yes, hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. One more question. In the lecture, you spoke about managing spaces, void spaces. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay. I would like to use your expansion a little bit on that aspect. The design of void spaces. I was just
Could you repeat that last part of the question? What would you like to know about these void spaces?
I would like you to expatiate a little bit on that in terms of design.
Okay.
Yes, sure.
You know, the whole history of the void and the opening or the atrium within a building is quite having a long history, and there is always a moment when you come into a building where suddenly you come into a void space, or a moment where you can see suddenly 2 floors or 3 floors opening within the organization of an architectural space. So for me, this history of the void space has been quite a spectacular quality when you look back to, for instance, the history of many buildings, like from museums or churches, mosques. I mean, there are many ways of how, in the history of religious architecture, cultural architecture, political architecture, the void has been always quite a critical social space. And I think this aspect of the social I'm fascinated in, so that people could meet in the void space, they can see each other, they can follow each other, and these principles I've been fascinated in over the years to develop in the work, and maybe it started with an early project like a house project in Berlin. I mean, I'm done talking about the beginning of, or the, yeah, maybe somewhere the end of the 90s or the mid 90s, and we've always used these void spaces to be playing with these ideas I just mentioned, but then also further extrude the idea of the texture of the void and how then the light can come into the void were further tested, and then even sometimes brought to the whole texture of the facade. So we didn't only work with the idea that the void would be the central space where people would meet, but that it is also further expanded from the void space towards more the outside texture of the facade as well. In order to let the building not only react purely alone to its contextual arguments, like of course you'd like to place a building in the relationship to its infrastructure, its urban setting, its organization of the city, its iconographic qualities you'd like to give to the city with the building, but we thought that it's also very important to think about the internal organization of the building, what can be expressed more through the void and then deeper in the building and end up in the facade.
I have another question from Ethiopia, Bekalu in Ethiopia. He says the super geometries that you work with might be considered luxury in some contexts. How would you justify them? And can you give some more explanations about the complications and possibilities of dealing with such structures?
Yeah, geometry has been very important always in architecture. Like if you look at the history of the city development, like the development of a city like Manhattan or a city like Amsterdam, the geometry of the city has modulated the whole aspect of consumption, production, the finance of the city, and we shouldn't forget that a similar kind of quality of geometrical principles have been playing a very important role in the making of buildings too. So if we talk about consumption, production, and the way how people use the building, it's often connected to organizational principles. So I'm not interested in geometry en zich or in itself, but I'm more interested in what the geometry can do to the organization of the building, and maybe I'm more fascinated in the principle of infrastructure and the routing and the way how people meet on the staircase, in the hallway, in the corridor or there wherever you have an infrastructural node to be brought towards architecture is for me already a first reason to think of the geometry of the building. Like for instance, if you take the Mercedes-Benz building with the double helix, the double helix is an infrastructural idea. It's not a geometrical idea. It might look as a highly complex mathematical geometrical structure, but it started on an infrastructural basis.
Ken Yosti has joined us online. So Adam, you can ask your question.
Yes, hi, how are you? Oh, we cannot hear you. Could you hear me? Do you hear us?
Sorry, we have really
We can't hear. They typed in their question, so I'll just ask it for them again.
Okay, please do so.
With regards to social sustainability of space,
Yeah.
is there a possibility in the future that people's perception of public spaces will change?
Yes. I think that social sustainability is a very interesting. Oh, can they hear us? Can you hear us? Hi guys, do you hear us? Okay, I just answered. So the idea of social sustainability, I think, is a very fascinating concept in architecture, because if we like so often, if we are using an elevator, then often I've noticed that people don't talk so much towards each other in an elevator, and I think that's not very sustainable. It's not sustainable simply because it's not very healthy to always take an elevator. It is much nicer to move around the staircase because you can meet each other, and there is hopefully with that a better way of exchanging knowledge. And I think the public space is to be found in many places of architecture. It's not to be found on the public square in the city alone. No, it's to be found also in the way how you meet each other in a waiting space or in the corridor before you go into the classroom, for instance. So there are many ways where social sustainable ideas can motivate people to work different, exchange knowledge, to share more ideas and to interact with each other much better than we engineer these spaces. So I do believe that a kind of form of social science is very important before you design a public space.
Okay, another question from Ethiopia. How do you set the proportion between habitable portion of spaces you design against the less habitable ones?
1 second. Could you repeat that question again? Sorry.
How do you set the proportion between the habitable portion of the spaces that you design against the less habitable ones? From Ethiopia.
Okay. Well, that's a good question, because in a way you cannot fully predict how people will fully occupy the building. But what is interesting, what I've learned, is to think a bit about a prediction of amount of people coming to a location. For instance, we have asked many times with some of the infrastructural projects we do, like for instance the train station project, to do calculations around the way how people will stay and wait in a particular place. Or in the living room, how much square meter do you need for certain habitational qualities and proportions? I think it is for each space a different calculation, but it doesn't mean that everything needs to be designed in a pure efficient manner alone. So that you can design spaces who are creating interaction, and you can make more compact if you want that. If you want a kind of form of comfort, so that you can dwell around the living room, for instance, or the way how you would like to organize a staircase. Then maybe seating elements can be introduced in the staircase, and you can make space for that. So, it's a matter of not so much how many people occupy and make the proportion of the space workable, but the most important is that you are thinking about the way what people are going to do in these spaces, and then you can proportion it.
Okay, thank you. Last question from Ethiopia. How can endlessness be achieved in an enclosed volume?
Well, that's a very nice question, because I think that's the best example of creating endlessness, because you will never go out of the room if it is enclosed. but I think the idea of an enclosed space is it depends again on how you design enclosed space, because if you make a kind of huge space within a closed space whereby people can walk around the space, and then when you have not a straight corridor with a dead end, then I'm saying that is actually the approach towards endlessness. So endlessness is having to do with the cycle of living, working and sleeping, for instance, what you can create in a house or in a city environment. But you don't make an organization of a building with dead ends. I think that the idea of building with dead ends is a very negative way of introducing a kind of quality of living with the time or working with the time of the everyday. Yeah.
We are trying to ask another question from Kumasi. Hello? Another one in from Ethiopia. Can I go on? Okay. They want to know how you work between the ordinary and the extraordinary with texture.
With texture?
Yeah. How you balance between the ordinary and extraordinary.
Some people like to have an extraordinary project. Sometimes that's nice. So some clients they have an extraordinary site and they want to have an ordinary building. They for a reasonable price. Sometimes the two can help each other a lot. I'm not particularly someone who is going for the extraordinary or the ordinary. I often think I hope that I can, out of something that is quite ordinary in its budget, for instance, or in its kind of context, I hope to make something extraordinary out of it. So I think that's the challenge of the architect, that that you're creative with the ordinary, and if something is over extraordinary, when it comes down to a budget, then sometimes I'd like to bring it down to something that is a little bit more down to earth.
Okay. They have another question from Central University. So, Joe, can you ask?
Yeah, easy.
Hello.
Hey, hello.
Okay. My question is more based on social networking.
Can you speak in the microphone again? I mean, can you come closer?
My question is more based on social networking in architecture.
No, you have to ask the question very slowly. Your question is about social?
Networking and its role in architecture. In a sense that current trends, people rather love to hang out in open spaces than in enclosed spaces. So how do we as designers try to adapt to these changes, apart from creating open spaces in design? Could you hear me, please?
Could you hear that somewhere? Could you hear? I mean, I could not hear it properly. Again, sorry, do it again.
Could you hear me now?
Yeah, now it's better. Yeah, this is better.
It's better now. Okay. My question, right, is more of social networking and its role
Yeah,
to architecture.
yeah,
And here's what I'm saying. In modern trends, you realize that people tend to spend more of their time in open spaces or outdoors. So how do we as designers try to meet up or try to suit this need as designers? That's my question.
well, let me try to answer it. I hope I understand you.
Okay.
If you work with the idea of, for instance, a network in architecture, like an urban network, then often we think, well, we have to think about the ingredients of the city, like the infrastructure program, that you think about the way how you deal with the heights of the building, and so that is, your network, your principles of the ingredients where you design architecture with, or urban planning with. But I am more interested in the way how you can set up with the internal organization of the way how the social qualities are creating a relational interest. So I'm sometimes interested in mixing concepts. Like, for instance, sometimes we have thought about the way how we could introduce a more cultural effect in a simple department store. Why would we in a department store sometimes only look at the commercial entities alone? Why would it not be nice to place the objects in a different way, and that you can then talk about the network of the way how people come to these objects and become a little bit more like art in a museum, whereby the product becomes almost kind of an art piece. So for me, the interesting thing is to combine different relational strategies between the social aspect of the way how people are going to use the building, the integral qualities of the spaces of the architecture, and also the elements placed within the architecture. So, and that they play and then an interactive role is for me essential, because then you can give many meanings and interpretations to the way how you perceive and experience architecture.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Olaf from Germany wants to know, is Ben seeing himself more as a handcraftsman or as an artist in these days because of his almost cultural construction? What does he think about to be an architect in these days? What does it mean to be an architect compared to his shown work?
Oh wow! One second. You know, it's so nice to be, in that sense, an architect, because you can give it many names. You know, you can call me an architect, you can call me a designer, you call me, you know, I mean, an architect can be, luckily enough, saying a bit, you know, that you are coming from many angles. And you know, in the history of architecture, luckily enough, architects were also artists. And I don't want to be given a name if I'm or either this architect or that architect. You know, I've many interests. I'm interested in the craft of architecture, in the details and the refinement of art. I'm interested in the cultural side of architecture. I'm interested in the scientific side of architecture. So I don't care so much if people have different interpretations, and maybe sometimes they're right, but I like to switch.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's all the questions from Kumasi
Thank you.
and
Thank you so much
Addis
for
Ababa.
organizing this. Thank you. Okay, thank
Then
you so
in that
much.
case, we end the call by now. Thank you very much for all your presence and your interest in us as a UN Studio and Ben van Berkel in special. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.